Welcome back, Wanderers, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. In this episode, we're going to examine 4 more of the lenses from Jesse Schell's The Art of Game Design. And to help us on our way, we are joined by the incredibly talented TJ Mota. TJ brings experience as a game writer and narrative designer with an impressive portfolio spanning various genres, from horror to romance. So, join us as we explore the lens of needs, the lens of novelty, the lens of motivation, and the lens of judgment. Working together, these lenses provide us with an understanding of player motivation and how to further engage those players in the narrative and the gameplay. TJ, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, hey, happy to be here.
I have been wanting to sit down and chat with you for a while, but you're a busy man with all the things you got going on.
Yes. And I'm here to make you rue that decision, let me tell you.
Good luck. Many have tried, few have succeeded. But we're here today to talk about 4 more of the lenses, because we're going through the series of we're wandering our way through all of the lenses in The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell. And we have selected 4 today to talk with you about: the lens of need, the lens of novelty, the lens of motivation, and the lens of judgment. Now, these 4 work together to help us understand player motivation. So that's where we're going. But before we dig into it, I like to start with a little bit, who is TJ? Like, what's your origin story? How did you fall in love with games? What did you play as a child? How did you get into the industry? The whole thing to get you here today, but a nice brief version.
TJ origin story. Well, it all started back in Florida. Pretty much just like playing games with my cousins and my friends. It was like just the, our communal ritual. Like games and hanging out was always hand in hand, whether it's competitive games like the N64 wrestling games where it just beat up on each other as Stone Cold and such, or just Mario Kart and things like that. Anything that got the group together and gave us something to just do while we just shoot the breeze. That was always there, and it's still commonplace now. I still keep in touch with my friends through online game sessions. It's just a way of keeping in touch despite us being in different parts of the country, different parts of the globe at times. So games has always been important for me for building and continuing relationships. But then also games is one of the places where I would go for escape and whatnot. I grew up a latchkey kid, parents work a lot, go home. It's all right, watch movies, watch games, do homework when you can. Sometimes not as often as I should, but so the stories and the imaginative worlds of games has always been something I would go to in my free time, and still do to this day. Mm-hmm. And I think growing up, I always found that, I enjoyed writing, I enjoyed storytelling, using my imagination and such. And so I knew of the 2 forms of entertainment that I always gravitated toward, film and games, that I would want to end up in one of them. Geared more towards film in the beginning, focusing on that in college. Mm-hmm. But eventually things got me to work in games. I think it's because I always wanted to end up in games in one way or another, but for whatever reason, film just seemed more practical, more realistic for whatever reason. And it was actually out when I was in LA for internships, and I was doing some assistant work there that I was within reach of actually working in games. One of my first job in games was actually as a QA tester for Respawn Entertainment, and then I got that right after my internships. So that got me into the world of games, and I just loved being in the environment of it, of working with the devs, seeing how games go about being built. And I was okay, yeah, I want to do this. I want to see if I can get into this with what I feel I'm good at, which is writing. And it took some effort. It took some, a lot of luck, as is the case. Cool. But I got there. Had my first opportunity of writing for games for this nonprofit game, and that's where I got to meet T&D alum Meredith Fletcher. Shout out to Meredith, fantastic human being. And that led me to having other opportunities down the line, writing for Crazy Maple, working on as a narrative designer for Arcs Entertainment, and eventually also led me to want to up my foundational knowledge of writing for games, led me to T&D, which, brought me to meet some amazing people, such as yourself.
Oh, that's quite the journey, buddy. That's really cool.
everyone's lives, and particularly lives in games, is a journey. So always fun.
Sure. I like to ask because it often informs the development of a designer or writer. Did you play tabletop board games? Were there physical spaces you were involved in as well as a child?
Not so much. I mean, board games has always been like a fun thing to do there, but like with just my network of like friends, like video games has always been something we would want to like spend more time in. Really, tabletop is something I've just been doing more recently. Like I have a tabletop campaign that I play monthly with some friends in T&D. Actually, we were all a bunch of people who just were new to D&D. Susan got us in touch with a DM who's actually a friend of Cam Beatty. Shout out to Cam. I'm going to do a lot of shout outs during this call, so
right on
for that.
Yes.
And yeah, we've been continuing that campaign for like over a year now. I've just been having a whole lot of fun with it. I don't know why it took me so long to like get into tabletop, but I've just been having a blast with it.
I love hearing that. It used to be very intimidating to get into, so it's understandable the people who didn't, but the point of entry is so easy now, and it's great to see everybody getting into that hobby I love so much for the last very many decades. I'm not going to age myself, but a long time. All right. Let's dig into the lenses, buddy.
Let's do it.
We're going to start off with the lens of needs. So, as a writer, a game writer, narrative designer, how do you approach identifying and then understanding the needs of a player within the narrative context of a game?
For me, it's really understanding what the player fantasy is for whatever it is that they're going into. So from my experience, it's been writing a lot of interactive fiction and briefly like working on an MMO as well, a mobile free-to-play MMO. And how that affects my my ability to craft narratives is pretty much different in that regard. But the one thing that like keeps both intact is identifying what that player fantasy is and understanding like what can I do with my writing with the design of this narrative that enables that, and that keeps that in mind, and it doesn't do anything to betray that kind of trust that the player has and the story that we're trying to tell them. So, and say one of the interactive fiction stories that I work on, it's understanding like why is the player interested in the story to begin with? What sort of fantasy am I trying to convey to them? And doing everything I can from the structure of each chapters, the hook at the end that keeps them wanting to come back, see what's next in the story, to most importantly, the interactive parts of that, the choices that is presented to the players, making sure that it's all in service of that player fantasy. That I'm not doing anything that kind of like betrays their ability to buy into it or feel like their agency in the story is taken away from them. And when it comes to the MMO, it's like, well, why do they keep coming back to it? Like, what were they interested in to begin with? Like, what is it about this game that they enjoy so much? And making sure that when I'm thinking of quests for them to do, thinking of storylines to do, thinking of dialogue scenes for them to engage with, that it's all in service to the type of experience that they want. You know, that I'm not wasting their time, that I'm not doing anything that kind of, you know, puts them in a position where they're like, they have to perform quests or do gameplay that they're just not that interested in. I don't want anything where it's like, this feels boring or this is not at all what I signed up for. So I think it's bearing that in mind. A lot of that is just like being willing to like make mistakes, getting the feedback from your team as far as like, hey, is this actually good? Well, yeah, a lot of prototyping, a lot of play testing to really like pinpoint like, okay, to be find the fun, is this actually in service to what the player wants, why they sign up for this in the first place? And at some point, just also like trusting yourself, knowing that like you kind of already have that instinct in you. That's why you're in this position to begin with.
Right.
So
that's smart. I like that. When you read the book, in this part of the book, when it's talking about this lens, Jesse goes into how like taps into Marlowe's hierarchy of needs and talks about base needs. And the one that jumped out at me that he talked about a bit was the idea that people often play games to satisfy the need for community, for connection. It's one of the basic needs. Does that ever come into consideration in your work? Do you ever consider how am I helping build connection or community amongst the players, or even for a single player in a game?
Absolutely. So I think in regards of tackling them both from like the interactive fiction and also from the free-to-play MMO case of like Adventure Quest 3D, where the interactive fiction stuff, the stuff I wrote for Grace and Maple and Digigo, it's all about like the relationships that the players make with the characters in that story, and giving them the interactive moments where they get to either expand upon those relationships or, like play around with them. It's like, here's some fun banter you can have, or here's something you can do to like screw over a character that they're going to remember that may come back to bite you in the end. I was writing a dark comedy whodunit, and it's like, okay, what kind of fun situations can we have here with these characters, and kind of like needling both the player character from the player character gets kind of like needled by these characters, and then the player character has some fun as well, teasing some of these characters and like insinuating like maybe you're the one that did it, who's to say. So yeah, building those characters and having it so that when a player does something in the game, it's remembered, it's called back to, it's referenced. So it feels like, okay, yeah, this does feel like a relationship that I am like nurturing here. And that these are characters that the player like wants to continue getting to know more of down the line, but they actually have some like investment in them and wanting to see like, okay, I do want to take care of this character. I do want to protect them. Or it's like, I hate this character. I can't wait until they get their comeuppance. Nice. So that's fun for that. And in the case of like a multiplayer game, I think something that we did a lot was we thought about creating experiences that got people engaged and wanting to play with their friends. So whether it's like multiplayer, like dungeons that require like a large party, thinking about like, okay, what are some things we can do that kind of like promotes teamwork during this encounter? But what is something there where it's like, okay, here's a side quest. It's a long chain, and we're not going to tell players where to find like these sort of like items or whatnot, right? There's a mystery here, and we kind of want the community to be like, oh, okay, let's try to solve this mystery. Let's try to find these clues. Where can we go in this world to find like the next step? Anything that engages the community and makes them excited to come back and play. And beyond just narrative, it's like, can we get some like social engagement here? They really like hanging out with the developers. So I know the team at Artix Entertainment, they really care about like doing social events, like getting everyone involved. And if we can tie that into the narrative in like some way, fantastic. If not, it makes the community feel like it's living and breathing, that these relationships matter and that they matter to the dev team.
Nice. That's an excellent example of how you did this in real time, like how you actually applied the lens of needs. I'm curious, and I'm kind of just digging here. Do you have any other examples where you had to have consideration for the needs of the player and how that impacted what you were working on and how it maybe made the experience better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a big concern for us, like I was at Artix Entertainment, was making sure that content was evergreen, right? That it not only that it lived on the game forever, but there's also like a good reason for the players to like come back and engage with that content. You don't want to spend time developing something just for players to like play it once and just like put it away. So I think in regards to like one event that we had timed around, I think some sort of yearly in-universe something that they do every year. The initial plan was just to have something like quick. It's like, okay, here's a little quest chain, here's a boss fight that you can do at the end. They can repeat the boss, what have you. And I remember one of the desires like, this is really fun. This is really what we can do. So they pitched an idea, and I really liked it. And I was like, that sounds fun. Do you think we can actually do that? And the idea was kind of like this faux MOBA like ongoing war event of these two factions. And I was like, yeah, I think I could do it. It's like, okay, I'm going to scrap my idea. I'm going to try to do something here that makes that fit with it, because I have no problem like just like dropping ideas if it means that I can help support someone else with something that they find really interesting, because I can feed off of that energy and be like, all right, yes, let's just make this as cool as possible. So we're able to work that into a narrative where we were introducing a new faction to this game, one that players who are familiar with that universe, they already know, but it was new to like this iteration of the game. And just to like kind of have fun. It's like, okay, we're building this ongoing war that the players can like participate in. They can even choose like which side of this war they want to be on. So we had some like fun with picking up like barks and whatnot for them, thinking up like why this is happening in the universe and what this could lead into in the future. It's kind of like, okay, we're going to tease some big storyline coming up down the line. And it allowed the players like, here's a new multiplayer activity that you can do in the game that gets people invested. It makes people actually care about, like, yeah, I'm team A or I'm team B. It got them really excited, not only for that moment of this new mode here, but excited about what was to come, which is awesome because doing this allowed us to do larger multiplayer modes down the line as well.
Very cool.
Yeah, that was fun there. And yeah, just working with my team and thinking up like new ideas, like that was always great. And seeing like the audience like respond to it, that was cool.
Right on. That's the whole point, right? That's the drum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, I think we covered the lens of needs. So let's hit the next one, the lens of novelty. So this lens is all about figuring out something new and unique to keep players engaged, and it's a critical part of the process. So TJ, how do you go about injecting freshness and originality into your narrative designs to captivate players?
Well, I think part of it is just, I think in the case of, say, like interactive fiction, it's like the team there, my editors, they know like the type of stories that people will want to invest time into, right? Like there's interactive fiction, all the stories kind of have like a similar type of like storyline they follow, right? There's just the novelty then comes into like, okay, well, this is a story that involves X, or this is a story that takes place here and there. And so part of our idea of like finding novelty is like finding a way to like engage the audience with like a different type of story that they might be interested, that may want to invest time into. And then in our part, ensuring that we capitalize on that idea. So say, for instance, like to call back to that murder mystery, the big thing was that it was a dark comedy, something that we didn't really have too much of on like the digital lineup of storylines there. And there's also a murder mystery as well. So, all right, a big thing of that was like nailing the tone and nailing this sort of like suspense on it, because it was a bit different from the other stories that we had been doing there at the time. And when I came onto that project, like so I took over from the chapter 6 onto the end, it was making sure that, hey, they coming in here because they want like a dark comedy and they want something that's a little wild and outlandish. So I had to make sure that as I continue on with the storyline that I was delivering on that we were getting kind of dark, that we were getting kind of absurd at times, but ultimately that there was also a mystery that kept the audience coming back to care about this story, that there were good hooks in there.
Uh-huh.
So I think the novelty in the case of like, just from my experience of doing interactive fiction, is figuring out what sort of stories that can appeal to certain people and ensuring that if we are presenting a player fantasy to them, that we're ensuring that we deliver on that. Now, if they come in there for a dark comedy and it's not funny at all, or it's not particularly dark, well, we kind of failed in delivering on that novelty.
Yeah.
In the case of like when I was working at Arcs Entertainment, it was just like, how fun and ridiculous can we be in this? How absurd can we get? Yeah, so when we had a desert themed storyline and we thought like, hey, let's have a witch in there, let's have a sand witch, if you will, someone who had the power over sand. It's like, well, this is a great opportunity for us to put in a pun there. As we're doing our like kind of brainstorming session, our phenomenal sound designer and composer is like, hey, what if we named the sandwich turkey? And I was like, we all laughed. We all thought that was funny. And it's like, yeah, that's so dumb, it has to go in. And so we did. And we built an entire storyline around that dumb pun of this turkey-esque named sandwich. And it was a lot of fun there. I think just like being absurd and like seeing how far we can take these one-off jokes, I got us some mileage there. And having these weird, novel, like one-off ideas. Like every Friday the 13th, we would do something fun in the game. And we started to develop this idea like every Friday the 13th in our oddity shop, a new curio would come in and it would lead to this one-off adventure. I remember our first one was a storyline about a demon that was trapped inside of a snow globe. Inside that snow globe was like the Evil Dead, like cabin in the woods type of thing there. So the players had to like go into the snow globe and stop this demon before it was able to escape and take over the world. And so, yeah, that idea that every Friday the 13th is going to be a new item there, a new adventure, that was something novel there for us. Keep the players engaged. I don't know that we still have some ideas for them.
I like that. That's cool, man.
Mm-hmm.
Just to twist it, just to try and come at it from a design point of view, can you think of a game that you loved or hated, or something where there was something novel about the gameplay or a mechanic or a loop that grabbed you?
I'm going to say the Stanley variable, because I think like the novel concept is that it's like the agency that the player has, or at least the illusion of agency that the player can have, as far as like, I'm not going to do what the narrator suggests I should be doing. Instead, I'm going to have fun doing something else. I'm going to go through this other door, or I'm just going to stand around in this closet and kind of see what happens there. And I think that what I loved so much about that game was trying to just like test the limits of what I can do in this game, how the game will respond to what I do. And there's something about just like staying in that closet for as long as possible. It's like, is he going to say something else now? Is there something else that's going to happen here? That's just so fun. Yeah, that would be my choice for that.
Excellent choice. So that kind of summarizes that lens, really. Like, the idea is to come up with something unique and interesting, novel, that is going to grab attention. That's one way to motivate players to stay engaged and get engaged with your game. So
I do know that in that same release where we did the sandwich storyline, that there were some mechanics that we wanted to try out that was new, that like played around with the player's expectations and some like the gameplay elements of that too. I know that boss fight itself introduced new mechanics that kind of put some players through a loop. And then we continued that forward with a dungeon later on. I was like, okay, well, you're not just going to fight monsters here. There's actually going to be a time mechanic here. There's this maze that you're in. The ceiling's going to come down. There's spikes on it. And nothing new in the world of like games, but it was new for our players in this particular game. Mm-hmm. So that outlandish idea with the sandwich kind of like got everyone's, ideas like kind of just like going as far as like, okay, what new things can we put into the game to kind of like follow along with this like outlandish storyline that we're doing that can kind of just like mess with the player a little bit here, and finding new ways to do that into the gameplay, finding like a little like parkour events that they can do, a little like time-based levels that we can do as far as like them navigating through the level and trying to get through something within a certain amount of time, and even some like weird items and way of going about like creating or acquiring items. Like it just sparked some creativity across the team as far as like wanting to design something like new that the players really were invested in, because like, oh, it's finally some like new ideas coming into the game. So that was fun for us.
Very cool. You kind of touched on something we should maybe mention, is the idea of the lens of novelty doesn't mean you have to come up with something that is completely new to the universe. It could be just new to the genre. It could be just new to your player base. It could be just new to that particular level. Like novelty can be macro or micro, which is cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that, subverts some of the players' like expectations as far as like what they're getting into. Someone's like, oh, here's a different type of quest that you can go on, or this dungeon is not going to behave similar to how past dungeons have gone in the past. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I think that puts a pin in the lens of novelty. So let's move on to this kind of a big general one, the lens of motivation. So, I mean, all of these lenses that we're talking about today have application to the concept of motivation, but this particular lens brings a much finer focus to how players are motivated. Let's be specific to narrative here. Engaging players with narrative can be challenging. So from your perspective, what are some effective strategies either that you've used or that you've seen in games you've played or on teams you've worked on for crafting compelling storylines that keep players motivated?
That is a darn good question. I would say I'll start off from just my perspective in the games that I have worked on. Was kind of like kept our players engaged. It is ensuring that we are adhering to what the player fantasy is and making sure that like no moment is wasted, that we are being very respectful for their time, and that we are constantly giving them reason to want to care about the characters, want to care about the world, and continue on. I'm talking specifically about like the interactive fiction at that point. And a lot of that is interesting choices that like keep them engaged and make them feel like they are having some sort of impact on the storyline. And keeping that momentum going with very interesting cliffhangers that make them really excited about what's coming next. That's, you know, a challenge just in storytelling in general of how do you create compelling stakes, some good conflict in there. And so in regard to like interactive fiction, it's fun dialogue that feels like, you know, player wants to keep reading, but they're not just like, you know, tapping through to kind of get like, okay, what's the next moment? Okay, let's just hurry up and go through this. It's what excites me. It's like that challenge I put upon myself. It's like, I want to create an interesting scene. I want to create these interesting choices that the player kind of even has to like really think about. And it's like, oh, I know you're probably doing this choice. I kind of want to see what happens if I do this choice here. And so that like motivates them kind of say like, okay, I made this decision. Now I want to see like what comes from it. Or better yet, once they've finished the story, it's like, okay, now I want to go back and play through and I want to see what happens if I do the other choices there. I know when I play games like say Baldur's Gate or any of like the super massive games, it's like, all right, I want to see what weird scenarios you put me in. I want to see what happens when I settle on certain choices. But also in the back of my head, I'm already thinking like, okay, when this playthrough is done, I want to go back and I want to see what happens when I decide to be a complete shitheel and just make all the worst decisions. What happens there? And that's always fun and engaging with that. So yeah.
So two things that actually come up quite often when I talk about this particular area with narrative designers that have been working for a while. One is the importance of the characters that populate the world in sharing what the world is and providing motivational hooks and points for the player. And then two is the consequences of choices that we make as a player and how that making consequences make the choices feel more important and therefore make us more engaged. I'm curious, do those two elements play into your process?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and those are probably the two things I put the most value in. I think those are some of the things I've like kind of really carry over from like my background in other forms of writing, particularly screenwriting, because some of the things that I've been taught there that I feel apply to this is the idea of like not having too many characters within the storyline and there being actual consequence to things that happen in the story that matter to the characters within it and that therefore matter to the audience. So I know like in the outlining phase of like anything I'm working on, whether it's like a game or a script or something, I always start off with more characters than I need, just the way it happens. And so when thinking about like those characters, like, okay, can I combine any of these characters? Like who can be composites that I can use going forward? And also understanding like what is the purpose of this character in our storyline, because I want to also make sure that like if I create scenes where the player character is interacting with some NPC or something, that interaction is worthwhile, that it's adding something to the experience. And I don't also want to set the expectation that this character that they had like a cool moment with, they think they're like, oh, this character is important, they're going to have like a big role down the line. It's like, actually, no, that was a one-off character. I don't want to lead them astray or give them the wrong expectations going in. So I have to be mindful of that, like what every interaction, what every bit of dialogue is doing to, Vonnegut said, reveal character and move the story forward. And that's something that I really put a lot of like stake into as I'm like writing these storylines. What role these characters play and what expectations it's setting for the player going forward. So I don't do anything that like defies those expectations or leave them feeling unfulfilled come the end of the story. Mm-hmm. And a big part of that is also just those choices that I lay out for the player as well. I want them to feel like they have impact, that they mean something there. Even those little moments where it's like, okay, we're just giving them the illusion of choice. I still want that to feel like it matters. I still want there to be some sort of either a callback to it or some sort of like reaction, whether it's directly in that moment or somewhere down the line, where it feels like, hey, the game remembers that, and that moment was important. Whether it was really that important doesn't really matter. Just that the player feels like that it matters, that choice has impact, and in some way, shape, or form, that they are dictating how the story unfolds. And those are my favorite moments there, where it's like, I did this thing. It's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Or it's like, hell yeah, I'm so happy that I did that there. And I want that for any of the stories I'm doing as well, because that's part of this experience that I'm trying to author for them. I want to feel like the time that they are putting in is well invested, and that I care about how they're interacting with the story I'm trying to tell them. It's a responsibility I don't take lightly, because the time investment, that's the thing that I hold like real most precious. It's like they're giving me their time. I want to be very respectful of that.
I love that, dude. I wish more game devs had that mindset. And lots do, don't get me wrong, but
yeah,
the ones who don't. Anyways, that's a fantastic summary of tying into player motivation. I like that. So the fourth lens, so kind of bring it all around. The fourth lens is a little different, but it does fit in here. The lens of judgment. And now this is not how we judge the game, but rather this is a lens of considering how is this game judging people. And as Jesse outlines in his book, people don't dislike being judged. People dislike being judged unfairly or incorrectly. We all like to be reaffirmed of who we are, or shown pieces of ourselves we don't know that we can learn from. We like that kind of judgment, that we crave that. So that's what we're talking about here. So with that in mind, this judgment that the game provides, it influences how players perceive and interact with a game's narrative. How do you, as a writer, or in your experience in games you've seen or worked on, ensure that the storytelling decisions align with the player's expectations, their preferences, what it is that they are craving as far as an experience that judges them?
That's a good question. And I'm going to try to stumble my way to an answer here. I feel a big part of that is a sense of like consequence, right? Whether it's in a game where there are like dialogue choices or any sort of like narrative decisions that you can choose, whether it's like a Telltale game, the Supermassive games, or even something like The Witcher or Cyberpunk, where it's like, okay, I have some agency here as far as like how I play this game, how I move forward in the narrative, or what I decide at certain points, or even how I build my character. And then what happens as a result for that? Okay, well, those games kind of judging. It's like, oh, you're playing Elden Ring. You decide to have a magic wielder that involves you need to be stationary sometimes. Well, here's a boss that moves around very quickly. Have fun with that.
Uh-huh.
As I have learned myself as a magic wielder who just wanted to Kamehameha bosses to death. It's like, oh, sweet summer child. You think I'm just going to stand here while you try to magic me to death? Have fun rolling around. Or if I decide to, sneak around and try to like rob someone in like an Elden Ring, in like a Skyrim type of game. It's like, why don't I just steal this thing? What happens there? And it's like, yeah, no, you were seen, and people are going to come after you now for that. Games like Baldur's Gate do that like so well, as far as like having there be like good outcomes for that. Anytime there's a game where it's like fuck around and find out, I am going to fuck around and I can't wait to find out. So it just makes it feel like alive and feels like that I actually matter, that my choices matter, that the way I play this game matters. And not only that, but it also like provides validation too. But it's like, if I do decide to do this and you have like a good response for it, I feel ecstatic. I feel like, yeah, I can play this the way I want. I think that's why like tabletop is so fun, because it's like, I want to do something here. It's like a good GM will be like, I'm going to let you do that. I'm going to let you deal with the consequences of that.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the ultimate dream. I know whenever I'm working on like interactive fiction, I kind of want to give those options there. And I kind of want to give some instant feedback following those decisions to be like, okay, no, that choice did matter in some way. Even if it was like one of those illusion of choices, it matters. The characters here remember that. And let's stick to. I think it's like playing games like Telltale. It's like I make a choice and it's like, so-and-so is going to remember that. It's like, oh no.
I love that they added that little piece, just those words, because then you stop and you go, oh, and there's consequences. What's going to happen? And then there's anxiety and trepidation and tension building, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, and you didn't have to build some sort of like visceral reaction for the players that are just kind of like sitting back on the couch, just kind of like a zombie playing through the game. Something that actually like engages them, makes them curious, or makes them kind of like, fret a little bit. That's fantastic.
Love it. I have a follow-up question that we're going to jump into, but when you mentioned the fact that the game can actually judge you right from character creation, it actually tweaks something in my head, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Factions, games that involve factions, World of Warcraft, Horde, and Alliance. The moment you choose which faction, suddenly the game is judging this is who you're part of, this group or this group, and then that becomes part of your identity, and you're motivated because I have to go and fight the Horde, or I have to go and fight the Alliance. So that in a way is using this lens to generate motivation.
Absolutely. And when you think about it from like a community aspect as well, it's like, oh, you chose to be Alliance? What's wrong with you? We're all Horde here. I'm like, I'm sorry, I think Stormwind's a cool place. Like, that's me.
Or the Alliance.
Hell yeah. There we go. There we go, people.
No, we're good. All my friends are yelling at me now. It's okay.
Same.
So, taking into consideration the lens of judgment, just to bring this whole thing to a head, can you think of a game that you played and loved that it either taught you something about yourself, something new, or reaffirmed something, a part of your identity perhaps, that you had a feeling about, but this really brought it home, that in the way that the game judged you and what it showed you? Okay.
Yes. And shout out to Susan O'Connor, because I'm about to talk about BioShock. I remember first time I was playing BioShock, and around that time as well, I was an Xbox achievement hunter as well. So anytime I started a new game, I'd always think about like, okay, how can I maximize this playthrough to get as many achievements as possible? And I knew at the time that there were achievements tied to the little sisters in the game, whether or not you harvested them all or whether you saved them all. So going into it, I was like thinking like the pros and cons, like, I get more this if I harvest them, but if I save them, this happens here. And I was just thinking about it solely from like just that mechanical standpoint there, as a feeling of kind of detached emotionally from it. But when it came time to actually like do that sequence and like choose whether or not to harvest a little sister, chose to save them. And that animation that plays through afterwards, that little like cinematic sequence, I remember just feeling absolutely horrified that I even considered harvesting a little sister. I was like, oh my God, this is a child. I'm a monster. And that kind of like really put into thought of like how much empathy I kind of feel towards characters in the world, how much I actually care about, doing good and not doing any harm. And that kind of like influence how I play games going forward. Maybe not particularly that game itself influenced it, but kind of like made me aware of the fact that like if a game gives me the choice of like, being a paragon or a renegade, I'm likely going to play as a paragon because I like being a good guy. I like helping other people. I don't want to inflict harm onto others. And so, yeah, I always play like the goody two shoes Superman route in like games there because that's just who I am. Sometimes I'll experiment with that. My Commander Shepard certainly did, pull the renegade trigger from time to time because like, hey, that's cool. And no one's going to think less of me because I decided to do that thing. Like, yeah, I am going to kick the security guard out the elevator window because that's badass. But yeah, and sometimes I will experiment, kind of like test the limits as far as like, hey, maybe you do want to be, a little bit of a roguish kind of like devil may care character in this playthrough. I was like, there's still going to be limits as far as like, yeah, I don't care. I'm not going to just do the evil route here. That's just not who I am.
Cool. Very cool. I'm curious. Do you think that changes over time? And I'll share my own personal experience for a second. The first game I ever played where I had like a bad, dark and light, a good and bad scale based on choices was Knights of the Old Republic way back in the day. And I was in a very dark place back then. And first playthrough, I drove the bar all the way into dark, and like if it could have gone further, it would have, kind of thing. And now these days when I play Baldur's Gate 3, I am trying to play through without like as clean as day, like the golden path if I can, kind of thing. And that's me recognizing the changes in who I am. Do you think that's part of the process? Is that something that we need to keep in mind when we're creating games?
I believe so. And I think particularly with games like Baldur's Gate that are like such a time investment, I know there's going to be players who are like, oh, I would like to experience this, or I would like to have a playthrough where it's like I do things that are like, different from what I would typically do. But because there's such a big time investment, because people just don't always have that time to, play multiple runs of the games, let alone finish a single run of a game, I can feel like it maybe puts the player sometimes in like a weird position as far as like, here's what I would like to do, but here's what I honestly know I'm always going to do as well. But I do feel like presenting those opportunities to the player is always worthwhile when it can be done. Just like kind of give those possibilities to the player to like have as much agency as possible, to have as much breathing room, to have an experience that they never thought was like possible, or like maybe I do kind of want to experiment a little bit and kind of like test my horizon, see like, how would I feel if I decided to just be, a roguish badass that just, kind of like looks out for themselves. And that's a bit different from what I would normally do. And it's like, yeah, anything that allows people to role play and kind of like test to see how they would respond in certain situations, that's always fantastic. That's what I really enjoy about like tabletop right now. I get to kind of like get out of my shell and kind of like play around as a different personality than I normally would. And I think like games provides like a nice kind of like safe environment for that. You're not going to be judged too harshly other than by like how the designers want the player to feel judged. There's no like real world consequences for like deciding like, what? I'm not going to save the tieflings. Just forget them.
Right on. All right, man. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of the core, the talking about the lenses. Before we move on to, I have a couple other quick questions. I just kind of want to bring it all together with a fun question of what motivates TJ? What makes you want to play a game, or makes you want to come back to an old game that you love and are very familiar with?
Oh, man. What does motivate me? Wish I knew that answer. I love just weird and absurd stuff. I think that's why like Psychonauts is one of my favorite games, 1 and 2, because it's so wildly imaginative, but it's so grounded and like just the human experience that I just love seeing such an abstract but still meaningful and personable type of world and characters that game explores. It feels like I get to both learn a bit more about myself and also in a way feel seen as we see like these characters who like have like these very real struggles, but it's done in such a wonderful outlandish sort of way. Anything that's like super imaginative, that's like, or is just really weird that I've never got to like experience before. That's what excites me. That's what makes me really love games, is being able to just explore these worlds, see things that I never would have thought possible, and be wondering like, why didn't I feel the world through this way? This is so cool.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
So you lean pretty heavily into the lens of novelty, things that are neat and new and unique and outlandish.
Absolutely. Because the world needs to be a little bit more fun. And I like absurdity where I can take it.
I'm right there with you. Mm-hmm. Okay. We're going to start heading towards the door. But first, I have a question that I ask everybody that comes on the show. I'm sure you are prepared for this one. And that question is, in my opinion, there exists a magical space at the intersection of the corner of story and game, but also improv, comedy, screenwriting, television writing, comic book writing, board game design, video game design, all of these wonderful things where we can all just sit down, hang out. There's a shared language. There's a fellowship. If you agree with me, and not everybody does, what is the magical thread that holds all this together?
And this question here, I feel like I do agree with you on this. And my thought on what that connecting thread is, and it's nothing too, original or anything like that. See, I think past guests has talked about this in a number of ways. And it's that kind of like sharing of ideas and sharing of perspectives, like how we see the world, that form of like self-expression that we can have here, and the way that the audience can engage with that. Whether it's like, that's what I love about games, like say Psychonauts. That's what I love about like, the films of like Tim Burton, where I get to like see this very kind of outlandish depiction of the world, but it's so grounded in like emotions and the human experience, where I felt like I can both escape, but also still kind of like feel seen, still be grounded with like my emotions in a certain way, where I can, learn a little bit more about myself or think of things in a lens I never would have thought of before. And like seeing how other people express themselves, seeing how other people can share their ideas and kind of help to either enlighten others or kind of just help people like feel certain things. That's what I love about it.
Nice. All right. Well, before we head out the door, I have what I called a quick fire. Just some quick questions to get to know TJ a little bit better. Just top of the head answers. What are you currently playing?
Oh, I don't really have too much time to play much, but kind of like calling back to like how games is a way for me and my friends to kind of like stick together. I try once a week to catch up with some of my friends on the East Coast, and we play a little bit of Divers 2. It's like a fun way for us to, shoot the breeze and shoot some robots and bugs in the same process of it. Have a lot of fun. Anything that inspires like a laughter and some like good times, I'm all here for.
Right on. What are you currently reading?
I'm kind of hopping around books at the moment, but one book that I'm reading that was recommended to me by a previous guest, Liv Peelan, is called Howls from the Wreckage, an anthology of disaster horror. She had mentioned that one of the stories in there is from the perspective of a teenage kaiju and them dealing with their human friend and their overbearing Godzilla-like father. And it's like, that's interesting. But then some of the other stories in there as well, it's like, oh, this is a little unsettling in the best ways. As someone who loves horror, it's like, I'm really enjoying this. And as far as like another book that I'm reading, I'm going back to one of my favorites, because it's been nearly a decade since I had like last read it. And it's Connie Willis's To Say Nothing of the Dog. One of the stories I just love so much. For those who aren't familiar with it, I would say, like, if I can use it's like blank meets blank sort of template to describe a book without giving any spoilers, it's like Back to the Future meets Downton Abbey. It's just such fantastic dry wit with a good time travel component to it. It's like, I just find thoroughly enjoying.
I'm going to check that one out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you could be uploaded into a digital game world, which world would it be, and what character would you be?
Oh, man. Just put me in a cozy game, man. Just put me in a cozy game. I just want to chill. Put me in Animal Crossing, man. I don't care if Tom Nook is like, hey, here's some loans for you. It's like, oh, whatever. Like, I'll gladly pay your loan. Just let me just do some gardening and whatnot. Let me just be a villager. That's all I want.
Love it. Okay, last one. If you could host a game session with any 4 people from any time in history, living or dead, who would it be and what would you play? And this could be a video game, tabletop, board game, card game, whatever.
Mm-hmm. All right. I've given this one a lot of thought. You can be the judge of whether or not that's true. I would like to invite Guillermo del Toro, who I just love as a creator, love his mind, love his passion. I like to invite John Carpenter as well. I just feel like I've enjoyed his movies growing up, and I just feel like he'd be a kind of a cool cat to be around. I want to invite Junji Ito because I really enjoy just how wild his stories are. Like his manga is just like deeply unsettling, and I love it. I kind of like want to create this like table like him and John Carpenter, and Del Toro would be like, all right, there's some weird horror here. And as we dip into like the madness as well, I want to invite the Macho Man, Randy Savage, be on this table as well as kind of being our wild card character. And what are we going to do? I don't know. I kind of want them all to play a game that's going to allow them to descend into that madness. Yeah. To like really test the limits of where their psyches can go as we play Mario Kart Double Dash and 50 rounds of Baby Park. I want them to do a lot of right-hand turns over and over and over again. I want to see where their minds descend to for that. I'm only partially kidding there. I would love to see that. I have done that with my friends, and let me tell you, that will really test some friendships. Words will be said that will not be forgotten. But you come out of that with a much stronger bond. But in reality, I would love to see those folks kind of like take turns DMing, Monster of the Week, some sort of like easy to go through like tabletop game with a horror mechanic on it. I kind of want to see where these Masters of Horror and Macho Man will kind of like take us. I feel like it'll be a fun ride.
I will watch that. That is fantastic. All right. Well, that's the end of the quickfire. Before we start heading out the door, I like to open up a little bit of space. Is there anything you're working on? Anything that you have worked on that you just want to boost or put out there?
I don't really like talking about myself all that much. But I would feel guilty if I didn't take this time to like kind of like talk about Susan O'Connor and the narrative department and her game writing masterclass, which we're about to start our spring 2024 version of. I'm a TA for that, and I'm really excited about the group of folks that we have taking this class here. They're awesome, and being a TA and helping to guide them through their experience in the masterclass is something that I take seriously. It's a responsibility that I really try to do the best I can to give them as best of an experience possible. Yeah. Well, great class, great people.
I'm fortunate enough that I can actually weigh in on this because you were my TA for my very first masterclass. And yeah, the experience was fantastic and in no small part because of you. So thank you, sir.
Much obliged.
Now, we're going to head out the door, but before we go, I'm going to give you the final word. So before you head out the door, any parting words of wisdom?
Be sure to tell him Large Marge sent you. No.
I'm so tempted to cut it right there, and that's it.
You are welcome to. You are absolutely welcome to.
Just might.
Have fun. I feel like, particularly in creative endeavors, we get so caught up in trying to get things perfect, or we kind of like lose sight of like why we wanted to create to begin with. It becomes a chore. It becomes, a fuel for imposter syndrome. You get to beat yourself up so often. Just remember to have fun. That's why you're doing this, why you're choosing to create in whatever sort of endeavor you are choosing to create in. Because it's a form of self-expression. It's a form of engaging others, sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, your wonderful creativity with them. Never lose sight of like how fun it is to do stuff, and follow that. If you're having fun with it, your audience is going to have a good time as well.
Well, you stayed a while, you listened, but now it's time to go. As we wrap up this enlightening conversation, I want to pause and say thank you to TJ for your invaluable insights into the intricate world of game design and narrative crafting. And to you, dear listener, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, remember, keep creating, exploring, and sharing your stories with the world. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the Corner of Story and Game.